So this week I thought I would paint this lovely little robin. Not very seasonal, we're in the middle of a heat wave here in the UK at the moment, but I came across this picture and I thought it was pretty cute. I know we did birds last week with the gannets, but this one is going to be more of a portrait with kind of unusual splatter effects in the background. And I got the reference photo from this from Pixabay. And I've just shown you the sketch here. What I'm going to do first is just use an eraser to get rid of some of these hard pencil lines, because you don't want those showing through when you put your watercolour over the top. This isn't going to be a line and wash painting, it'll just be a regular watercolour. So I'm just knocking that back a little bit so we've got nice light pencil work to start from. I'll leave the colours that I'm going to use in the description box below for this one, so you can have a look if you want to have a go yourself. I'm trying not to get rid of all of the pencil work. I still want a little bit of a guide, and I've gone into a bit more detail this time than I usually do with drawings. So first off, I'm just using masking fluid over the top of the eye and the legs of the robin. You don't have to do this step if you don't want to, you can just paint around them. I'm using masking fluid because I find it easier just to make sure it's covered and I don't go over it with the wash, and then it's easier for me just to fill it in at the end. But yeah, it's not an essential part, so don't worry if you don't have masking fluid for this step. So I'm going to be doing a lot of wet in wet painting for this. So one of the first things I'm doing now is just using clean water to cover the whole of the robin. I'm not covering all of the beak, but I'm covering pretty much the rest of him with clean water. And I'm going to do the first layer pretty much in one go, which is a little bit intimidating. So you can try and make it a little easier for yourself by pre-mixing some colours. For this section I am using quite a lot of colours. I'll use yellow ochre, cadmium yellow, cad red, burnt sienna, some sap green, cobalt blue, alizarin crimson and Payne's grey, I think is the other one I'm going to use here. And it's useful to have some of your mixes already done, so you can just drop them straight in and you don't have to worry about mixing them while the paper's drying, and that way you can work quite quickly. Some of the colours I'll use directly just as they are without mixing, but three of the mixes I will be using. There'll be one which is cadmium red and yellow mixed together, more on the yellow side than the red. The next mix that I'll use will be yellow ochre, burnt sienna and sap green. And the third mix will be some cobalt blue, a tiny touch of alizarin crimson and Payne's grey. So if you have some of those ready to go to begin with, you can just put them straight on the robin then without having to mix as you go. So I'm going to start first with yellow ochre and just drop that in the bottom left hand corner of the robin, and then sticking with the yellowy orange tones I'm going to go in with cadmium yellow all across the red breast of the robin first, and then start building up some more oranges on top of that. So we're starting with cad yellow, and then we're going to use that cadmium yellow and red mix to put in some of the darker areas. And then on top of that I'm going to use the burnt sienna, sap green, yellow ochre mix just along the bottom edges of that as well to create a few extra shadows. I'm going to use that same burnt sienna mix for the wings and for the top of the head, just to put in that initial wash. You can always make it darker by adding a touch of cobalt blue to it as well if you feel like you need to, but I'm going to go over this again so it doesn't matter if it's not completely dark the first time around. And now I'm using the Cobalt Blue, the Payne's Grey and a touch of Alizarin Crimson just to do the grey feathers behind the robin. Because this is wet and wet, they're going to blend in together a little bit, which doesn't really matter. And it's also going to soften as well once this dries, so it's not going to dry as dark as what you see right here. I'm putting in some of the tail feathers at the same time, so just different mixes of what we've used already. Some Cobalt Blue and Payne's Grey for more of the blue tone, and then adding in some crimson for the more reddy brown feathers. I'm also going to lift out some colour at this point as well, so using a damp brush, not one that's super wet because you don't want to force some unnecessary backruns. I'm just lifting out a few areas that I want to keep highlighted, and you'll see me doing that a few times throughout this, and all of the time it's just to highlight some areas and lift out some of that paint colour if it's got a little bit too dark. And for the branch the robin's sitting on, I'm going to start similarly again, so wetting the page first before we add paint on, and then you can use that wet in wet technique where it should blend together. You can really use any colour for this. I am using some Alizarin Crimson, some burnt sienna, a touch of Cobalt Blue to darken it up a little bit, adding more blue, more Payne's Grey every time I want to make it a bit darker. But you can use any colour for this, it doesn't really matter. I'm keeping the shadow on the left hand side and just putting in a few smaller details here and there. So now I'm just working my way around the robin one bit at a time and just darkening up some areas and making sure that they're pretty much dry underneath before I do this so that it doesn't all run together, and we can build up some shadows using similar turns as before, but because it's not wet in wet it will dry darker this time. For the beak, I'm going to use Cobalt Blue and Payne's Grey in a really light tone along the top. And then for the bottom of the beak, I'm going to use Crimson and some burnt sienna, maybe a touch of Payne's Grey again, for a more of a red tone along the bottom edge. And I'm dragging it a little bit into the rest of the colour of the robin so it blends together. And because it's already pretty much dry, it shouldn't bleed out too much at this stage, which is what we want. We don't want to make a mess right around the beak. So I'm going to use the same tones that I just used on the beak to add in some detail along the branch, just dragging the brush along for some texture, drawing in some lines, strengthening the shadows, just trying to make it look a bit more realistic. So I left the robin to dry completely before I move on to this step, and I'm going to wet the whole thing again and put in another layer. Now you can leave it as it is if you like what you've already created. Some types of watercolour paint are so pigmented that you get a really nice effect just from doing this once. But because some of these colours have dried quite light, I'm going to go over it again. I'm not going to do the whole thing again, but I am going to add in some darker tones, and it's all really similar to what I did the first time. So instead of listing every step on this, it is just going to be a repeat of what we did before. So adding in some cadmium yellow, some cadmium red for some more orange in the front of that robin, more burnt sienna, just building up shadows, highlighting areas, just trying to add a little bit more detail in this section. I'm using some Payne's Grey for these shadows just to really make them pop. Now I'm removing the masking fluid from the feet and the legs, and I'm going to use Alizarin Crimson, some burnt sienna and maybe a touch of Cobalt Blue for the legs. Just keep it really simple, using the same colour for the feet and the legs, and then just darkening it up by adding in a bit more pigment, a bit more crimson, and some more Payne's grey for some of the shadows, and then putting that in over the top. I'm doing the same with the eye, removing that masking fluid, and then I'm going to start out with some Cobalt Blue to begin with, just for the lighter tone underneath, and then I'm going to go over that with some Payne's grey, leaving some space around the top for a little bit of a highlight. So now I'm just refining it and adding detail where I think it's needed. This will be a little bit different in each watercolour painting, even if we're using the same reference photo, because watercolour can behave completely differently. Even if you are the exact same artist doing it the exact same way, it will still give you a different result. So your detail will probably be a little bit different, but I'm just trying to get rid of some of the areas I don't like, make some of the shadows in other areas stand out a little more, and yeah, just working to bring it all together. Alright, so this is the part where I am going to add in a background. So you really don't have to do this if you'd rather just keep it as it is. It is perfect as a standalone portrait. I want to add a little bit of colour in the background and just make it more arty and creative. but it's quite intimidating doing this because I have no idea how it's going to turn out. So I am just splashing on some clean water here and there and everywhere, and I'm going to drop some colour in that. You could always do a background around the outline of your robin to begin with, if you're worried about potentially ruining it at the end. But I am going for it, and we're just going to see what happens. I am going to use some blue and orange in the background. You can use whatever colours you want to mix this up, but I'm using Cobalt Blue and some Payne's Grey, and then some Cadmium Yellow and Cad Red for the orange, and I'm just dropping it into that clean water that we made at the that we put on the background. So I'm also going to use some splatter effects as well, just hitting the back of the brush with that orange and that blue paint to create some little dots, little splatter effects here, there and everywhere. I'm going to put some clean water in there too, just drop that in, and for some backgrounds, some salt, just to get a variety of textures and see what happens. I am going to cover the robin up so that I don't get it covered in paint while we do the background. Now, orange and blue, well, this orange and purpley colour are almost opposites on the colour wheel. So if they mix together too much, they're going to just form a weird brown. So you don't want to have that much brushwork in this bit. You want to keep it quite loose and spontaneous, rather than muddy it a little bit, because it's going to look, it will end up looking completely brown if the orange and the purpley blue mix together too much. So I have left it to dry, and now I'm adding in some extra details. I'm using some white gouache just to put in a little highlight in the eye, and also highlight some of the feathers that are a little bit brighter. I'm also using some of it in the background, and I'm going to work on the background some more as well with some darker blues and oranges because it dried quite light. Now this is the stage of a painting where it's super easy to overwork it, which is quite possibly what I am doing here. So you can always just take a break and come back to this, see if you think it needs any extra work doing to it rather than continuing, and you might decide that you like it exactly as it is. I obviously have not taken that approach, and I'm adding some extra details now. I'm putting some white gouache in the background, and I'm going to add some extra colours, some extra splatters, and just see where it goes. But I mean, either option is fine. So I'm redefining a few areas of the robin where it meets the background, just so you can see that it's separate. I'm using some darker shadow colours for the tail and just to go around the edge of the robin. I'm also going to use some blue on the right hand side just to depict a couple of feathers, add some more splatters in there, and then I'm going to darken up the background a little bit and show you what that looks like at the end. So this is the part where I just added in some darker purple and orange just on top of that wash that we already did. So this is the finished painting, and you might notice it looks a little different. Once it had dried, I decided to come back and just revisit a few areas. I made the eye a little bit bigger, and I think that's made a ton of difference to the painting. So I just went around the edge again with some Payne's Grey and used some white gouache, some watered down white gouache to preserve that white highlight around the edge. I decided to go over the tail feathers again and just keep those nice and dark. I used a nice dark shadow colour along the legs as well, just to highlight those. And I also used some of that burnt sienna, yellow ochre and sap green, just to go over the face again and some of the shadow under the eye and across the top of the head, just to make it stand out a little bit more. And I think it made all the difference, and I'm pretty happy with how that's turned out. So this is our lovely robin all finished. Thank you so much for watching. I will be back again next Wednesday with another tutorial.